This is Mr. Wesley, and there is a trend running quietly through the lives of divorced men over 50 that the cultural conversation has not yet found an adequate language for. And it is this. A growing number of these men have stopped organizing their post-divorce lives around the pursuit of a new relationship, and they are, by their own consistent and specific account, significantly happier for having stopped. Not because they have given up on connection, not because they have become bitter or withdrawn, or have decided that women are the enemy or that intimacy is a trap. Those narratives exist, and they are loud, and they are not what I am describing today. What I am describing is something quieter and more interesting and considerably more useful than any of those narratives. The specific experience of a man who spent decades inside a marriage that required a great deal of him, who went through the specific and demanding education of that marriage's ending, who did the rebuilding work I described in the new male era video, and who arrived, somewhere in the second or third year of the post-divorce period, at a relationship with his own life that is so genuinely satisfying that the urgency he once felt about finding a partner simply is not running anymore. Not because he decided to stop feeling it, because the rebuilding produced something that removed the deficit the urgency was responding to. I am Mr. Wesley. This is Relational Insights. Let me show you exactly what happened and why. Start with what the chasing actually was, not the specific behavior, the calls, the dates, the effort, the presentation of the self as an attractive and available partner, but the psychological function the chasing was serving. For most men who emerge from long marriages into the post-divorce years, the urgency to find a new partner is not primarily about wanting a specific person. It is about wanting to resolve a specific and uncomfortable internal state, the specific discomfort of a man whose identity was organized around a partnership that no longer exists, whose social world contracted significantly when the marriage ended, whose daily life lost the structure and the sense of forward direction that the marriage was providing, and who is experiencing that loss as an urgent and uncomfortable void that a new relationship seems like the most obvious available solution to. The chasing is not primarily romantic in its motivation, even when it presents itself as romantic. It is regulatory. It is the attempt to use an external relationship to resolve an internal deficit that the external relationship was never actually designed to resolve, and that it cannot sustainably address even when it temporarily appears to. The man who finds a new partner from that deficit position may find, as many men do, that the initial relief of having resolved the urgency gives way, within months or a year or two, to the recognition that the deficit is still present, that the new relationship is now carrying the same regulatory burden that the original marriage carried, and that the specific and uncomfortable internal state the chasing was trying to resolve has simply relocated itself inside a new structure rather than been actually addressed. The men who stop chasing and feel better for it are almost universally the men who address the deficit directly rather than solving for its urgency through the pursuit of a new relationship. They rebuilt the social infrastructure that contracted when the marriage ended, so they are no longer experiencing the specific and painful social isolation that made a new partner feel like an emergency. They rebuilt the sense of purposeful direction that the marriage was providing, so they are no longer experiencing the specific and disorienting purposelessness that made the future feel unnavigable without a partner to navigate it with. They rebuilt the relationship with their own interior lives that the marriage years had often suppressed, so they are no longer experiencing the specific and unrecognized loneliness of a man who has been alone inside his own head for years and who has been misidentifying that loneliness as a need for a specific other person. When those deficits are genuinely addressed, not managed, not compensated for by the temporary relief of new pursuit, but actually addressed at the level of the underlying need, the urgency resolves, not as a decision, as a natural consequence of the deficit no longer existing in the form that was generating the urgency. The man who has rebuilt a genuinely full life does not experience the absence of a partner as a void, because the space the partner would have filled is already occupied by something he chose deliberately, rather than by the anxious reaching of a man trying to resolve an emergency. That is the first and most foundational reason the stop chasing produces increased happiness, rather than the resignation and loneliness the cultural narrative predicts it should produce. The chasing was expensive. It was consuming time and energy and emotional bandwidth in the service of resolving a deficit that could be addressed more directly and more durably by other means. The stopping of the chasing, when it is the genuine outcome of the deficit having been addressed rather than the defeated withdrawal of a man who has given up, frees those resources for the life he is actually building, which turns out, in the consistent experience of the men I am describing, to be a considerably more satisfying use of them. The second reason is the specific and well-documented relationship between autonomy and well-being in men over 50 that I described in the Happier Alone video. I want to add a dimension to that finding here that is specifically relevant to the chasing dynamic. The pursuit of a new relationship, when it is organized around urgency rather than genuine preference, requires a specific and ongoing compromise of autonomy that men in the post-divorce years are often not conscious of making until they stop making it. The management of the presentation of the self as an attractive and available partner. The calibration of behavior to what will be received well, rather than what is genuinely natural. The ongoing monitoring of another person's responses as the primary feedback mechanism for the man's own sense of how he is doing. All of these require a continuous and often significant investment of the specific autonomy that the post-divorce years, done well, are structured to restore. The man who stops chasing, stops making those compromises. His attention, which was previously organized significantly around the question of how he is being received by the women he is pursuing, returns to the question of what he actually thinks and wants and is genuinely interested in. The reorientation of attention from external reception to internal direction is, in the research on male well-being past 50, one of the most consistent predictors of increased life satisfaction. Not because external relationships are not valuable. The research is clear that they are, when they are genuinely good. Because the chronic, external orientation of the chasing posture is itself a significant drain on the well-being of the man sustaining it, and its removal produces a relief that is both immediate and cumulative. Picture this. There is a man I know, I will call him Peter, who spent the first 2 years after his great divorce at 60, organizing his post-divorce life significantly around the pursuit of a new relationship. He was not approaching it carelessly. He was thoughtful about it, deliberate, investing genuine time and attention in the dating process with the same seriousness he had brought to every other significant undertaking of his life. And he was, by his own account, quietly miserable in a way he could not fully explain, because he was doing everything right by the conventional framework for how a man in his position should be spending his time. The misery had a specific quality that he described to me in a way that has stayed with me. He said it felt like running a second job that he had not applied for and could not quit. The monitoring of the apps, the calibration of the messages, the management of the early-stage interactions, the specific and continuous low-grade anxiety of a man who is waiting to find out whether the thing he has been pursuing is going to work out, all of it running in parallel with the rest of his life, consuming attention and energy that had no particular return to show for the investment, and producing a relationship with his own life that felt secondhand, because his primary attention was not on his own life, but on the ongoing question of whether a new person was going to enter it. Peter stopped at the beginning of his third post-divorce year, not dramatically, not as a manifesto or a decision he announced to anyone. He simply noticed, one morning, that the monitoring and the calibrating and the low-grade anxiety were consuming more than they were producing, and he stopped. He redirected the attention to things he had been meaning to do, and had not done because the pursuit had been occupying the bandwidth they would have required. He reconnected with 2 friendships that had thinned because the post-divorce period and the pursuit had both been consuming time that the friendships needed. He returned to a physical practice he had abandoned during the marriage. By the end of the third post-divorce year, Peter described himself as the happiest he had been since his 30s. Not because he had found what he was looking for, because he had stopped looking in the place where it was not, and had invested the looking in directions that were actually returning something. Here is what I want to add to Peter's story that I think is the most practically important thing in this video, because the risk with this narrative is that it gets received as an argument for permanent withdrawal from connection, rather than as what it actually is. Peter did not stop wanting connection. He stopped organizing his entire post-divorce life around the urgency of finding it. And the specific and important thing that happened as a result of that stopping was not that connection became unavailable to him. It became available to him in a different and considerably higher quality form. Because the man who is not chasing is the man I described in the previous video. The genuinely self-sufficient man whose contentment in his own life is real rather than performed, and who is therefore capable of entering a connection from a position of genuine choice, rather than from the contracted urgency of a man who needs it to work out. Peter met someone in his 4th post-divorce year, not through the apps he had stopped monitoring, through a community he had invested in because it genuinely interested him, which is the only investment that produces the kind of social environment where the right connection has a reasonable chance of appearing naturally rather than being manufactured through the specific and exhausting mechanics of contemporary dating at 60. He told me the relationship he is in now is the most genuinely mutual partnership he has ever experienced. And he attributes a significant portion of that to the specific state he was in when it began. A man who was genuinely not chasing, who was genuinely okay without it, and who chose it from a position of surplus rather than deficit. The relationship is an addition to a life that was already full rather than the solution to a life that was empty. And the difference between those two foundations, in his experience and in the research that supports it, is the entire difference between a partnership that is genuinely sustaining and one that is carrying a regulatory burden it was never designed for. The real reason men have stopped chasing is not resignation. It is not the defeat of a man who tried and failed. It is the specific and logical outcome of a man who addressed the deficit that was driving the chasing, rather than trying to solve for the urgency of the deficit through the pursuit of an external solution. And the happiness that follows from that addressing is not the hollow contentment of a man who has lowered his expectations. It is the specific and genuine satisfaction of a man who finally figured out where the actual work was and did it. Drop a comment. Men, if you have stopped chasing and found yourself happier for it, what was the specific moment or realization that produced the stopping? And what did you redirect your attention toward when the chasing stopped? Subscribe to Relational Insights. Every week, Mr. Wesley breaks down the real psychology of men's lives after gray divorce. Not the cultural narrative about what men should be doing, but the honest and precise account of what actually produces the life worth having.